One, two, three. Alright, this is it. The last chronological video in the series. This video will cover film movements from the 90s and one in the 2000s. Technically one in the 80s, but we'll get to that. I'm gonna stop it at the early 2000s, because it just feels like the 2000s and 2010s, whatever. It just may be a little bit too soon to cover something historically, since informal canon and some of the historical impacts might not be quite clear yet. I feel pretty good about covering the 2000s film movement that we'll get to. But anything beyond that, I'll probably just leave alone for, whatever, people in the next decade to cover. 5 film movements today, we'll get right into it. The first one is the Taiwanese New Wave. This is kind of an oversight on my part, because this probably should have been in the 80s. Although it is a bit of a weird case, because as I learned, the bulk of the historical impact in the movement was in the 80s, from 1982 to 1987 specifically. But a lot of the most notable works came in the 90s and as late as 2000. So when I was looking at my list of films from film movements I had watched, I had categorized it under the 90s, but as it turns out, it's also fair to talk about it in the 80s, but here it is. The Taiwanese New Wave came out of a shifting socio-political landscape, and mostly led to a certain examination of Taiwanese culture and identity. The films often had a languid, observant style, a poetic feel to them, allowing viewers to look at the lives of real-seeming characters, well-realized and grounded characters that belonged in Taiwanese society, and focus on cultural identity and where, in general, the country was at. There were 3 main directors to focus on for this movement. There's Ho Xiaoxian, Tsai Ming-liang, and Edward Yang. Ho Xiaoxian is a favorite director of mine, chiefly for directing Flowers of Shanghai, which is one of my favorite movies. But that kind of falls outside the boundaries, perhaps, of this movement, although it does concern, it does have the same stylistic hallmarks, perhaps, as some of these movies. Strictly speaking, his most relevant films for this movement include A City of Sadness and The Puppetmaster. His work certainly fits the poetic style that is, common among these 3 directors, the slower style. Although it is kind of interesting getting into some of his earlier stuff that I've watched. He did start out fairly lighthearted pop cinema before making that transition into this more serious and observant style. Although you can see the transformation along the way. It's quite fun. Next would be Tsai Ming-liang, best known for Rebels of the Neon God and Vive L'Amour. And Edward Yang may be the most well-regarded of the trio. He has had, I believe, 2 different films, A Brighter Summer's Day and Yi Yi. Both of those have placed highly in the Sight and Sound lists. So clearly a lot of respect for his works. Taipei Story falls within the main 1982 to 1987 time period for this movement, and alongside those other works, is well worth a watch for the historical value. Next is new queer cinema. This is arguably still ongoing in a certain way, but really the term originally applied to a surge in queer films made in the early 90s. Now that the movement is less underground, has more mainstream footing and mainstream credibility, you could say, thanks in part to films that have received great awards attention and acclaim like Moonlight and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So this movement might not be quite descriptive of the current state of queer cinema, and instead refers to this initial sort of underground and independent movement. There were certainly queer films before the 90s, some notable ones like Scorpio Rising or Chantal Akerman's work like Tu Il Elle, and some of the work of Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Even earlier, Jean Cocteau for his work in the 30s. But this specific movement may have arisen as a direct response to some societal challenges. Things like the perceived lack of response to the AIDS epidemic, experiences of the AIDS epidemic, and a general political swing towards conservatism, particularly in the US under the Reagan era, and in the UK with Margaret Thatcher. For some general thoughts on the movement's emergence, you can seek out this article that I will try to remember to link by B. Ruby Rich, talking about the emergence of the movement in, I believe, 1992. She wrote the article. But at the time, the movement began to be more represented in film festivals and more independent circles like that, rather than becoming as mainstream as it would become. Some notable works include Paris is Burning, which is a highly acclaimed documentary which covers the New York City drag scene, and The Watermelon Woman, which focuses on underrepresentation of minorities in cinema. You could also point to contributions from some directors like Greg Araki and Todd Haynes for some of their own contributions to the movement. Next, Dogma 95. This may be the most distinctive movement of the list. It is also the most clearly defined. I don't know if I'm trying to remember. I don't think there's another movement, at least that I have encountered, that is as specific and rigid, technically, as Dogma 95. Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg co-authored a manifesto which defined a series of rules and guidelines to follow in order to be a Dogma 95 film. This manifesto was heavily inspired by Une certaine tendance du cinéma, which was a sort of manifesto from the French New Wave. This manifesto detailed 10 different rules, and I will link to it because it's a quick read. But essentially, those 10 rules were to allow the filmmaker to focus on what they considered to be the fundamentals of filmmaking, which would be like storytelling and performances. It was a bit of a response to cinematic maximalism, and they wanted to create a opposite extreme movement towards minimalism, which directors could follow and contribute to. This is probably the only cinematic movement that has a specific canon that is tracked, as there are 35 Dogma 95 films from 33 different directors. The two most recognizable names are, of course, Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. They've certainly had the most success within and without the movement. Each of them made one Dogma 95 film. This would be The Idiots from von Trier and The Celebration from Vinterberg. I mean, I love The Celebration. It is, I think, a great example of not just working within given constraints, but additionally using those constraints to help heighten the actual material and using those constraints to provoke creativity in a unique way. For a fun contrast, you could double feature The Celebration with, say, Another Round, which is another one of Thomas Vinterberg's works, and just see the contrast, within him as a filmmaker. Granted, they are 20 years apart, so, you could expect some kind of progression. But regardless, you can see what he's capable of within the restrictions of Dogma 95 and what he is capable of in just, regular old good film. I also enjoy Open Hearts specifically. I think that's my second favorite Dogma film I've seen. But in a certain way, any of these films is equally useful to check out because they all more or less follow the same rules. They all have some degree of rule breaking and rule bending. I think it's kind of interesting to listen to some of the behind-the-scenes stuff about The Celebration to kind of hear about the little ways in which they broke rules here and there, but they're forgiving, and they're pretty close. They stick pretty close. Next, Nuevo Cine Mexicano. This is basically viewed as a new golden age of Mexican cinema. This is, I haven't been calling this out for every movement, but most of these movements are heavily influenced by Italian neorealism in some capacity. I didn't call it out for Taiwanese New Wave, for example, but a movement like that, a movement like Nuevo Cine Mexicano, which are both characterized by close to the ground depictions of regular people, a realistic close-up view of society. All movements that are characterized by something like that draw heavy inspiration from Italian neorealism. So, of course, this movement focuses heavily on economic, social division, sometimes the role of even Spaniards as invaders in certain cases, especially in a movie like Pan's Labyrinth. Most notable directors are the so-called Three Amigos of Mexican cinema, who would be Guillermo del Toro, Alejandro González Iñárritu, and Alfonso Cuarón. Guillermo del Toro is probably the biggest name of the three, probably has the most mainstream recognition. Of course, most recently for something like Pinocchio, but he has also made significant contributions to the horror genre. His particular brand of horror tends to have accentuated human drama, and the horror is a main aspect of it, but the main focus of his horror is often human drama related. For his work, you could easily check out Pan's Labyrinth, as previously mentioned, for some big hallmarks of the genre and his certain flair of fantastical ideas and presentation. Cuarón has made arguably the best movie of the three of them, with Harry Potter and no, I'm kidding, of course, it's Children of Men. But in this specific movement, he would be best known for Y Tu Mama Tambien, And then Iñárritu has made highly praised films in his own right, such as Birdman and The Revenant. For this specific movement, you could go check out Amores Perros. Last movement, Mumblecore. This is going to be our first and only 2000s film movement. It started way at the beginning of the 2000s, 2002, so that feels like a long enough distance given that the movement is more or less formally completed. We'll touch on that at the end. This was made possible by increasingly cheap and portable and reliable digital filming, which helped allow for smaller production crews, simpler productions, lower budgets, and it enabled the directors to capture this specific goal of extremely grounded character depictions. This movement tends to depict characters who are young adults attempting to figure their way out in life at, what is a pre-midlife crisis that's being shown. These films often feature realistic and imperfect dialogue. Again, the goal is to try to mimic real life basically as much as possible. And I think actually this movement draws an interesting comparison with neorealism, because Mumblecore almost has the ability to be more realistic than Italian neorealism because it is done now in the 2000s. The difference being the predominant acting style, whereas now actors tend to go for a much more realistic or at least recognizable acting style, whereas in the 40s the predominant style leaned still a little more theatrical, even if, what neorealist actors were doing wasn't like a transatlantic accent or quite perhaps as theatrical as Hollywood productions. Still not as recognizably realistic, I would say, as the predominant acting style of right now. So in combination, the realistic acting, focused on realistic dialogue, the simple stripped down productions make for compelling and relatable and realistic character depictions. Now granted, the range of characters that are depicted in this series of films is pretty narrow. It is like a lot of them do tend to focus on like big city white people. So, it's certainly possible that a lot of people might not be able to relate. Regardless, these films do what they do. They do one specific thing. They do it quite well, in my opinion. It is worth noting that any Mumblecore films from past 2010 or so are often considered to be post-Mumblecore, as the original core group of directors who made this kind of film had started to move on to other types of projects, and things from past 2010 are often considered to be slightly different. From among this movement, I would recommend Frances Ha and Drinking Buddies. So that'll do it for the chronological film movements. I may come back to pick up a few extra film movements that I may find interesting. Maybe I'll add to the list to grab a few more that catch my eye. These videos tend to do better than the random film reviews anyway, so, gotta pump up the numbers. But next I'll probably try to get out some of the top 10 lists just for fun since I've got those sitting around. So maybe I'll do 1963 or one of the 2020s next. Either way, I'll see you in the next video.